The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform jacket for the third time. The fabric felt heavier than usual, weighted not by its material, but by the memories it concealed. She had been summoned to the main briefing room for what her commanding officer had cryptically called a special inspection, and the knot in her stomach told her this wasn't going to be routine. Sarah had served in the Army for 12 years, rising through the ranks with a combination of tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication that had earned her the respect of soldiers and officers alike. Her record was spotless, her performance evaluations consistently outstanding, and her leadership during 3 overseas deployments had saved countless lives. Yet as she walked through the corridors of Fort Henderson, she felt like that frightened 19-year-old recruit all over again. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy when she arrived. Dozens of officers from various units had been assembled, their faces showing the same confusion she felt. Colonel Harrison, her immediate superior, caught her eye and nodded toward an empty chair in the front row. As she made her way forward, she noticed the unusual presence of several high-ranking officials she didn't recognize, including a stern-faced woman with general stars on her shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the murmur of conversations. "Today we have the honor of hosting General Patricia Kellaway, who has come to conduct a special review of our personnel records and conduct standards." The general stepped forward, her steel-gray eyes scanning the assembled officers with the intensity of a hawk surveying its territory. General Kellaway had a reputation that preceded her, known for her zero-tolerance approach to military discipline and her ability to spot the smallest infractions in uniform or conduct. She had built a career on maintaining the highest standards of military bearing. Officers throughout the service spoke her name in hushed, respectful tones, knowing that a review by General Kellaway could make or break a career. "I've been reviewing the files of several officers in this command," the general began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "There are certain standards we maintain in this man's army, and I've noticed some concerning patterns in uniform regulations and personal presentation." Her gaze swept across the room before settling uncomfortably on Sarah. Sarah felt her mouth go dry as the general's attention focused on her. She had always been meticulous about her appearance, understanding that in the military, how you presented yourself was often the first measure by which others judge your competence. Her uniforms were always pressed to perfection, her boots shined to a mirror finish, and her bearing reflected the pride she took in her service. "Captain Martinez," the general's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Would you please stand?" Sarah rose from her chair, her training taking over as she snapped to attention. Every eye in the room was now on her, and she could feel the weight of their collective scrutiny. "I've been reviewing your file, Captain, and while your service record is admirable, I have concerns about your adherence to uniform regulations." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. In all her years of service, she had never been cited for a uniform violation. She took pride in her appearance, understanding that the military's emphasis on uniform standards wasn't about vanity, but about discipline, unit cohesion, and respect for the institution they all served. "I notice you consistently wear your uniform jacket buttoned to the top, even in warm weather when regulations would permit a more relaxed standard," the general continued, her tone suggesting she had found evidence of some hidden transgression. "This has been noted in multiple reports from various base activities and ceremonies." Sarah's heart began to race, but not for the reasons the general might expect. The jacket wasn't about regulation adherence or personal preference. It was about concealment, about hiding truths that she had carried for over a decade, truths that had shaped every day of her military service, but that she had never shared with anyone in her chain of command. Furthermore, General Kellaway continued, consulting a tablet in her hands, "There have been observations that you declined to participate in certain recreational activities that would require less formal attire. The base swimming facility reports that despite your excellent fitness scores, you've never utilized their services. The medical facility notes that you consistently request the same physician for routine examinations. Each observation felt like another layer being peeled away, exposing vulnerabilities that Sarah had spent years carefully protecting. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this public examination was moving beyond normal military critique into something more personal and potentially humiliating. "General, if I may," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. She had faced enemy fire, navigated political minefields in foreign countries, and made life and death decisions under extreme pressure, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of exposure in front of her peers. "You may not," the general interrupted sharply. "I'm not finished with my observations, Captain." The dismissal stung, reducing Sarah's years of experience and proven judgment to irrelevance in the face of uniform regulations. "I believe these patterns suggest either a misunderstanding of military standards or a deliberate attempt to circumvent established protocols." The accusation of deliberate circumvention hung in the air like an indictment. In the military, intent mattered enormously. A mistake could be corrected with training and guidance, but deliberate violation of regulations suggested a fundamental lack of respect for military authority and order. Sarah's mind raced through possible responses, each one seeming inadequate to address the complexity of her situation. How could she explain that her uniform choices weren't about defiance or misunderstanding, but about survival? How could she make this general understand that some battles continued long after the official war had ended? "I'm going to ask you to remove your jacket, Captain," General Kellaway said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I want to see if there are any unauthorized modifications or non-regulation items that might explain your unusual attachment to this particular piece of your uniform." The request hit Sarah like a physical blow. Around her, she could feel the collective intake of breath from her fellow officers. This was crossing into territory that felt more like a strip search than a uniform inspection, and several of the assembled officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his face showing concern. "General, perhaps we could conduct this inspection in a more private setting?" His suggestion was diplomatically phrased, but Sarah could hear the protective instinct of a commander who had watched her excel under his leadership for 3 years. "Negative, Colonel," the general replied without taking her eyes off Sarah. "These uniform standards apply equally to all officers, and if Captain Martinez has nothing to hide, then a simple inspection should pose no problem." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, framing Sarah's potential reluctance as evidence of guilt. Sarah felt trapped between impossible choices. Compliance would expose truths she had guarded carefully for years, potentially derailing a career she had built through sacrifice and determination. Refusal would be seen as insubordination, equally damaging to her standing and future prospects. Either path seemed to lead to the destruction of everything she had worked to achieve. The silence stretched painfully as Sarah weighed her options. She thought about the young soldiers under her command who looked up to her for leadership and guidance. She considered the missions still ahead, the lives that might depend on her experience and judgment. The military had given her purpose, structure, and a family of brothers and sisters in arms who had become the foundation of her adult life. But she also thought about the girl she had been before the military, the frightened teenager who had enlisted not just for college money or career prospects, but for escape. The Army had saved her in ways that went far beyond professional development or financial security. It had given her strength, confidence, and the tools to rebuild herself into someone worthy of respect. "Captain Martinez," the general's voice cut through her internal struggle, "I'm waiting for your compliance with a direct order." The formality of the language made it clear that this was no longer a request, but a command carrying all the weight of military law and regulation. Sarah straightened her shoulders, drawing on every ounce of the strength and courage that had carried her through 12 years of military service. She had faced down insurgents in Afghanistan, negotiated with hostile tribal leaders in Iraq, and led rescue operations in disaster zones. She had earned her rank through competence, not charity, and proven her worth in situations where failure meant death. Her hands moved to the top button of her jacket, and she could feel the collective attention of the room focused on this simple action. Some of the officers looked away, uncomfortable with what felt like a public humiliation of a respected colleague. Others watched with a morbid fascination of witnesses to a career-ending moment. As her fingers worked the first button, then the second, Sarah made a conscious decision about how she would handle whatever came next. She had spent too many years hiding, too much energy concealing truths that had shaped her into the officer and leader she had become. If her career was going to end here in this briefing room, then it would end with honesty rather than continued concealment. The jacket fell open, revealing the crisp white shirt beneath. But as Sarah began to remove the jacket entirely, sliding it off her shoulders and down her arms, she exposed something that made several officers gasp audibly. Her left arm, from shoulder to elbow, was covered in a complex pattern of scars, some thin and precise, others jagged and raised. The marks told a story of violence and survival that had nothing to do with military service and everything to do with the life she had escaped when she enlisted. The scars weren't hidden because they violated regulations or represented some shameful secret about her military service. They were concealed because they spoke to a different kind of battle, one fought in civilian homes and family relationships where the enemy wore a familiar face and the wounds were inflicted by those who claimed to love her. General Kellaway's expression shifted as she took in the extent of the scarring, her professional detachment giving way to something more human and complex. The neat rows of thin scars spoke to methodical abuse, while the larger, more jagged marks suggested moments of particular violence or desperate self-defense. This wasn't the result of military action or even accidental injury. This was the roadmap of systematic abuse survived by someone who had found the strength to escape and rebuild. The briefing room fell into complete silence as the assembled officers processed what they were seeing. Sarah stood at attention, her jacket hanging loosely in her hands, no longer attempting to hide the evidence of her past. Her chin was raised, her gaze steady, meeting the general's eyes without shame or apology. Colonel Harrison's face showed a mixture of shock and protective anger, finally understanding why one of his best officers had always seemed to carry invisible burdens despite her professional competence and dedication. Several of the other officers looked away, recognizing that they had just witnessed something deeply personal that challenged their assumptions about strength and vulnerability. Sarah waited for the general's response, prepared for whatever judgment might come. She had survived worse than professional embarrassment or career setback. The military had given her the tools to rebuild herself once before, and, if necessary, she would find a way to rebuild again. But she was done hiding the truth of where her strength had come from and what it had cost her to achieve the stability and respect she now enjoyed. The scars on her arm told a story of survival, of a girl who had found the courage to escape an impossible situation and remake herself into someone capable of protecting others. They represented not shame, but transformation, not weakness, but the kind of strength that could only come from surviving the unthinkable and choosing to build something better from the ruins. As the silence stretched, Sarah realized that this moment, terrifying as it was, might also be liberating. For 12 years, she had carried the weight of concealment, the constant energy required to hide her past while building her future. Perhaps it was time to discover whether her worth to the military was strong enough to survive the truth of how she had become the officer she was today. General Kellaway continued to stare, her professional mask slipping to reveal something more human and unpredictable. The inspection had uncovered far more than uniform violations or regulatory infractions. It had exposed the complex reality of what it meant to serve, to rebuild, and to find redemption through dedication to something larger than personal survival. The next few seconds would determine not just Sarah's career, but how the military would choose to respond when faced with the complex truth of one soldier's journey from victim to leader, from survivor to protector of others. General Kellaway's stern expression began to shift as she processed the full implications of what she was seeing. The scars on Captain Martinez's arm weren't random marks or the result of military action. They told a story that was all too familiar to someone who had spent 30 years in military service, working with soldiers who came from every possible background and carrying every conceivable burden. The pattern of the scars spoke volumes to the general's trained eye. The thin, parallel lines suggested systematic cutting, likely self-inflicted as a coping mechanism during periods of extreme stress or emotional pain. The deeper, more irregular marks indicated violence from external sources, probably inflicted by someone in a position of trust and authority. The fact that they were concentrated on areas normally covered by clothing suggested someone who had learned to hide their pain while continuing to function in daily life. "Captain Martinez," the general said softly, her voice carrying none of the harsh authority it had held moments before. The change in tone was so dramatic that several officers looked up in surprise, recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic of this inspection. "Please put your jacket back on." Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure whether this was another test or a genuine offer of dignity. The vulnerability of standing exposed in front of her peers was almost overwhelming, but she had committed to honesty, and retreat now would feel like a betrayal of the courage she had just summoned. "I said, put your jacket back on, Captain," the general repeated, but this time her voice carried the protective authority of a commander looking after one of her soldiers rather than the cold judgment of an inspector finding fault. "That's an order." As Sarah slipped her arms back in her jacket and began buttoning it, she noticed that General Kellaway had moved closer, positioning herself between Sarah and the other officers in a way that provided a measure of privacy. The gesture was subtle but significant, suggesting that whatever came next would be handled with discretion rather than continued public exposure. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general announced to the room without taking her eyes off Sarah, "this inspection is concluded. You are all dismissed except for Captain Martinez and Colonel Harrison." The authority in her voice brooked no argument, and the assembled officers filed out quickly, sensing that they had witnessed something important that was now moving beyond their purview. Colonel Harrison remained at attention until the last officer had left and the door had closed behind them. The sudden quiet of the empty briefing room felt heavy with unspoken questions and revelations. Sarah continued to stand at attention, unsure whether she was about to be disciplined, counseled, or simply sent away to deal with the consequences of her exposure privately. General Kellaway walked to the windows that overlooked the base, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that Sarah recognized as the stance of a leader working through complex decisions. When she turned back to face them, her expression had undergone another transformation, revealing something more personal and less institutional than Sarah had expected. "Captain Martinez," the general began, "I owe you an apology. What I just put you through was inappropriate and exceeded the bounds of any reasonable inspection." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I've been in this business long enough to recognize the signs of someone who has survived domestic violence, and I should have approached this situation with more sensitivity." The acknowledgement hit Sarah like a wave of relief mixed with confusion. In all her years of military service, she had never heard a general officer apologize to a subordinate, especially not for following what appeared to be standard inspection procedures. The admission suggested that General Kellaway understood far more about Sarah's situation than her initial harsh approach had indicated. "Permission to speak freely, General?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. The formal request was habit, but she genuinely needed to understand where this conversation was heading and what implications it might have for her career. Granted, the general replied, settling into one of the chairs and gesturing for both Sarah and Colonel Harrison to do the same. The shift from standing inspection to seated conversation marked another change in the dynamics of their interaction, moving from military formality towards something more resembling counseling or problem-solving. Sarah chose her words carefully as she sat down. "General, I've never reported the circumstances that led to these scars because they occurred before my military service began. They have never interfered with my performance of duty, and I've worked hard to ensure that my personal history doesn't impact my ability to lead soldiers or complete missions." The explanation was factual and professional, but Sarah could hear the defensive undertone in her own voice. She had spent years justifying her choices and proving that her past didn't disqualify her from military service. The habit of self-protection was so ingrained that even in this moment of forced honesty, she found herself building walls around her vulnerability. General Kellaway nodded thoughtfully. "Captain, I'm not here to investigate your personal history or to suggest that your past disqualifies you from service. Quite the opposite, actually." She paused, glancing at Colonel Harrison before continuing. "I've been conducting these inspections throughout the command, and, frankly, I've been looking for officers who demonstrate exceptional resilience and leadership despite facing personal challenges." The revelation caught Sarah off guard. What she had interpreted as harassment or persecution was apparently something entirely different. The confusion must have shown on her face because the general continued her explanation with something that might have been a slight smile. "The Army is facing new challenges, Captain Martinez. We're asking our soldiers to deploy repeatedly, to operate in complex cultural environments, and to make decisions that require not just tactical knowledge, but emotional intelligence and personal strength." General Kellaway leaned forward, her tone becoming more conversational. Traditional metrics of officer evaluation don't always identify the leaders who can guide soldiers through these kinds of challenges. Colonel Harrison spoke for the first time since the other officers had been dismissed. "General, Captain Martinez has been one of my most effective company commanders. Her soldiers trust her completely, and she's demonstrated exceptional judgment in difficult situations. I've never had any concerns about her leadership capabilities." The endorsement was strong and unqualified, representing the kind of professional support that Sarah had worked years to earn. Hearing it articulated in front of General Kellaway felt like validation of every choice she had made to prioritize competence over disclosure, performance over explanation. "That's exactly what I hoped to hear," General Kellaway replied. "Colonel Harrison, your recommendation carries significant weight, and it aligns with everything I've observed in Captain Martinez's service record." She turned back to Sarah. "What I'm about to discuss with you is classified at the highest levels, and your participation would be entirely voluntary." The mention of classification and voluntary participation immediately caught Sarah's attention. In her experience, when general officers talked about classified voluntary assignments, they usually involved either exceptional opportunities or exceptional dangers, sometimes both simultaneously. "The Army is developing a new program," General Kellaway continued, "designed to identify and train officers who can work effectively with military personnel who have experienced trauma, particularly those dealing with the aftermath of domestic violence, sexual assault, or childhood abuse." The program description felt intensely relevant to Sarah's own experience, almost as if it had been designed specifically with her background in mind. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand the direction this conversation was taking. "Are you saying that what happened here today was part of an evaluation for this program?" The possibility that her humiliation had been orchestrated as some kind of test was both infuriating and oddly reassuring. "Not exactly," the general replied carefully. "I knew from your medical records and behavioral patterns that there were likely issues in your background that you had chosen not to disclose. The inspection was designed to give you an opportunity to demonstrate how you handle pressure while maintaining your integrity." She paused. "What I didn't expect was the extent of what you revealed, or the courage it took for you to be honest rather than defensive? The explanation felt simultaneously invasive and respectful. General Kellaway had clearly been evaluating Sarah's psychological resilience and leadership potential, but she had also created a situation that forced Sarah to confront her own relationship with secrecy and shame. This new program, the General continued, would involve working with soldiers who have similar backgrounds to your own. Many of our best fighters come to us carrying burdens that they've never shared with anyone in their chain of command. They serve effectively, but they often struggle with trust, intimacy, and long-term career planning because they're expending so much energy on concealment. The description resonated deeply with Sarah's own experience. She thought about the countless hours she had spent carefully managing her appearance, her activities, and her relationships to avoid triggering questions about her past. The energy that went into maintaining that level of secrecy was exhausting, and she could imagine how liberating it might be for soldiers to work with someone who understood their struggles from the inside. What would this assignment involve? Sarah asked, her professional curiosity overriding her emotional reaction to the morning's events. Despite the manipulation and exposure she had experienced, the prospect of using her background to help other soldiers was genuinely appealing. You will be assigned to a special unit that works with high-value personnel who have been identified as having undisclosed trauma in their backgrounds, General Kellaway explained. Your job would be to help them develop coping strategies that don't require concealment, to build trust with their chain of command, and to ensure that their personal histories become sources of strength rather than vulnerability. The scope of the assignment was broader than Sarah had expected, involving not just counseling or support, but active leadership development for soldiers whose potential was being limited by their need to hide their pasts. It was exactly the kind of work that would utilize both her military expertise and her personal experience. There would be additional training required, the General continued, including advanced education in trauma psychology, leadership development, and crisis intervention. The Army would fund your education through a master's degree program while you transition into your new role. The offer was extraordinary, representing not just a new assignment, but a complete career transformation that would position Sarah at the forefront of military personnel development. It was also a validation that her painful past could become the foundation for meaningful service to others facing similar challenges. Colonel Harrison looked between Sarah and the General, his expression showing both pride in his officer's selection for such an assignment and concern about losing one of his most effective leaders. General, how long would this assignment last? And what would be the career implications for Captain Martinez? The initial assignment would be 3 years, General Kellaway replied, with the possibility of extension based on program success and Captain Martinez's preferences. As for career implications, this program is being developed with full Pentagon support. Success in this role would position her for accelerated promotion and leadership opportunities in the Army's evolving approach to personnel management. The career prospects were impressive, suggesting that rather than being derailed by her past, Sarah's willingness to be honest about her experiences could actually accelerate her professional development. It was an outcome she never could have imagined when she first enlisted as a desperate teenager, looking for escape and stability. Sarah took a deep breath, considering the full implications of what was being offered. The assignment would require her to be open about her background in ways she had never contemplated, to use her painful experiences as tools for helping others rather than secrets to be hidden. It would mean stepping out of the comfortable anonymity she had built and becoming a public advocate for soldiers dealing with similar challenges. General, Sarah said slowly, if I were to accept this assignment, what guarantee would I have that my personal history wouldn't be used against me if the program were discontinued or if political attitudes toward these issues changed? The question reflected hard-earned wisdom about the unpredictability of military policy and political winds. Sarah had survived too much to risk her career on a program that might disappear with the next change of command or shift in Pentagon priorities. That's a fair concern, General Kellaway acknowledged, and I can't give you absolute guarantees about political changes beyond our control. What I can tell you is that this program has support at the highest levels, including from the Secretary of the Army and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Your participation would be documented as a special assignment, not as a confession of personal problems or weakness. The assurance was as strong as could reasonably be expected in the military environment, where personnel policies could change rapidly in response to external pressures or leadership transitions. Sarah realized that some level of risk was inherent in any significant career decision, and the question was whether the potential benefits outweighed the possible dangers. "I'd like 24 hours to consider this offer," Sarah said, recognizing that such a major decision shouldn't be made in the immediate aftermath of the morning's emotional upheaval. "And I'd like permission to discuss it with someone outside my chain of command who can help me evaluate the personal implications." "Granted," the general replied without hesitation. "Take whatever time you need, Captain Martinez. This opportunity isn't going anywhere, and I want you to be completely confident in your decision before you commit to such a significant change in your career path." As the meeting concluded and Sarah prepared to leave the briefing room, she realized that the morning's events had fundamentally changed her relationship with both her past and her future. The scars on her arm no longer felt like shameful secrets, but like qualifications for a new kind of service. The question now was whether she had the courage to build a career on honesty rather than concealment, to help others by sharing the strength she had found in her darkest moments. Sarah spent the next 24 hours in careful deliberation, weighing the opportunity General Kellaway had presented against the life she had built through years of careful concealment. She walked the base grounds after duty hours, thinking through the implications of stepping into such a public role after spending her entire military career avoiding attention to her personal history. The officer she chose to consult was Major Rebecca Chun, a military psychologist who had become a trusted friend over the past 2 years. Rebecca had never pried into Sarah's background, but had offered quiet support during difficult moments without demanding explanations. Her professional expertise and personal discretion made her the ideal advisor for this decision. They met at a quiet coffee shop off base, away from the possibility of casual observation by other soldiers. Sarah explained the morning's events and General Kellaway's offer, watching as Rebecca's expression shifted from concern to amazement to something that looked like professional excitement. "Sarah," Rebecca said after hearing the full story, "this sounds like an incredible opportunity, but I need to ask you some direct questions about your emotional readiness." Her tone was gentle but clinical, reflecting her training in helping military personnel work through complex psychological challenges. The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion Sarah had ever had about her background and its impact on her military service. She found herself describing not just the physical abuse she had endured, but the emotional manipulation, the systematic destruction of her self-worth, and the long process of rebuilding her identity through military discipline and achievement. Rebecca listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped Sarah articulate feelings and experiences she had never put into words. The process was exhausting, but liberating, like draining poison from an old wound that had never properly healed. "The work you'd be doing," Rebecca explained, "would require you to relive your own trauma repeatedly as you help others work through theirs. That's not necessarily harmful, but it requires a level of self-awareness and emotional stability that not everyone possesses." She paused thoughtfully. "From what you've told me, and from what I've observed of your leadership style, I think you have those qualities. But you need to be honest with yourself about whether you're ready for that level of emotional exposure." The question struck at the heart of Sarah's concerns. She had spent years building walls around her painful memories, accessing the strength they had given her while avoiding the pain they still carried. Using her experience to help others would require dismantling those protective barriers and finding new ways to manage the emotional impact of her past. There's another consideration, Rebecca continued. Success in this kind of role often leads to becoming a public advocate for trauma awareness in the military. You might find yourself speaking at conferences, consulting on policy development, even testifying before Congress about the needs of soldiers dealing with similar issues. The scope of potential exposure was broader than Sarah had initially realized, extending far beyond the special unit General Kellaway had described. That evening, Sarah called her older sister Maria, the only family member she maintained regular contact with after cutting ties with their abusive household. Maria had been her lifeline during the worst years, providing emotional support and ultimately helping her escape to military service. Her perspective on Sarah's decision would be crucial. "I'm proud of you for even considering this," Maria said after hearing about the opportunity. "For years, I've watched you help everyone around you while refusing to let anyone help you. Maybe it's time to discover what you can accomplish when you don't have to hide who you are." The conversation with Maria crystallized something important for Sarah. She realized that her need for concealment had limited not just her personal relationships, but her professional effectiveness. How many soldiers under her command had struggled with similar issues without feeling safe enough to seek help? How many opportunities for meaningful connection and support had she missed because of her own defensive barriers? The next morning, Sarah returned to General Kellaway's temporary office with her decision. The general was reviewing personnel files when Sarah knocked, and she looked up with an expression that suggested she had been expecting this visit. "General, I accept your offer," Sarah said without preamble. "I'd like to join this program and help develop new approaches to supporting soldiers with trauma histories." The words felt both terrifying and liberating as she spoke them, representing a fundamental shift in how she would approach her military service. General Kellaway smiled, and for the first time since their initial meeting, her expression showed genuine warmth rather than professional evaluation. "I'm glad to hear that, Captain Martinez. I believe you'll find this work more rewarding than anything you've done in your military career so far." She gestured for Sarah to sit down. "Now let's discuss the practical details of your transition." The conversation that followed covered the logistics of Sarah's new assignment, including her transfer to a special unit based at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, her enrollment in a master's degree program in trauma psychology at Georgetown University, and her gradual transition from company command to her new specialized role. "Your first assignment," the general explained, "will be to work with a group of senior non-commissioned officers who have been identified as having exceptional leadership potential, but who appear to be limiting their own career advancement due to undisclosed personal issues." The description sounded like a version of her own story multiplied across multiple soldiers, each carrying burdens that were preventing them from reaching their full potential. "These are soldiers who perform at the highest levels under pressure," General Kellaway continued, "but who struggle with standard military social expectations like unit social events, family readiness groups, or leadership development programs that require personal disclosure." Sarah recognized the pattern immediately, remembering her own careful avoidance of situations that might require her to share personal information or appear in casual clothing. Over the following weeks, Sarah prepared for her transition with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She completed her final responsibilities as company commander, ensuring a smooth handover to her replacement and saying goodbye to soldiers who had become like family over the past 3 years. Many of them expressed surprise at her sudden reassignment, but they also offered enthusiastic support for what they understood to be a promotion to special duties. Her last day at Fort Henderson was marked by a ceremony that felt more significant than the simple change of assignment it officially represented. Colonel Harrison presented her with a commendation for her exceptional service, highlighting her leadership during difficult deployments and her consistent care for soldier welfare. But it was his private words afterward that meant the most to her. "Captain Martinez," he said as they walked together after the ceremony, "I want you to know that discovering your background hasn't changed my opinion of your abilities one bit. If anything, it makes your achievements even more impressive." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I hope this new assignment allows you to help other soldiers find the same strength you've shown." Sarah's first week at Fort Belvoir was devoted to orientation and initial training in trauma-informed leadership techniques. The program was more sophisticated than she had expected, incorporating the latest research in psychology, neuroscience, and organizational behavior to create comprehensive support systems for soldiers dealing with adverse childhood experiences or domestic violence histories. The other officers in the program came from diverse backgrounds, but they all shared certain characteristics: exceptional performance records combined with behavioral patterns suggesting concealed personal trauma. As they worked through training exercises and shared their experiences, Sarah realized that her story was far from unique. The military attracted many people seeking structure, purpose, and escape from difficult circumstances. Her first case assignment was Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a 20-year veteran with exemplary performance reviews who had repeatedly declined opportunities for advancement to warrant officer or commissioned officer ranks. His file showed a pattern of exceptional competence combined with social isolation and apparent discomfort with leadership responsibilities that required personal disclosure or vulnerability. Sarah's initial meeting with Torres took place in her office, a space she had decorated to feel more like a counselor's office than a traditional military command environment. She had learned from her own experience that creating a sense of safety was essential for meaningful conversation about personal trauma. "Sergeant Torres," she began, "I want to be clear about why you're here and what I hope we can accomplish together." She had decided to be direct about the program's purpose rather than approaching it obliquely. "You've been identified as someone with exceptional leadership potential who may be limiting your own career advancement due to personal factors you haven't shared with your chain of command." Torres's reaction was immediate and defensive. "Ma'am, if this is about my performance, I can provide documentation that shows I've exceeded standards in every metric for the past 5 years." His response was exactly what Sarah would have said in a similar situation, focusing on professional competence while deflecting attention from personal issues. "This isn't about your performance, Sergeant," Sarah replied. "Your professional record is outstanding. This is about removing barriers that might be preventing you from pursuing opportunities that match your abilities." She paused, making a decision that felt risky but necessary. "I'm going to share something with you that might help you understand why I'm qualified to have this conversation." Sarah then did something she had never done in her military career. She told another soldier about her background. She described the abuse, the scars, the years of concealment, and her recent decision to use her experience to help others. The telling was neither dramatic nor self-pitying, but matter-of-fact, presenting her history as qualifications rather than confessions. Torres listened in silence, his defensive posture gradually relaxing as Sarah spoke. When she finished, he sat quietly for several minutes before responding. "Ma'am, how did you know?" His question was simple, but it carried the weight of years of careful concealment and the relief of finally being understood. "Because I recognize the patterns," Sarah replied. "The way you position yourself in meetings to avoid certain kinds of physical contact. The fact that you decline social events, but never miss professional training. The exceptional performance that seems designed to forestall any questions about your personal life." Each observation was based on her own behaviors, tactics she had used to maintain privacy while building professional credibility. What followed was a conversation that stretched across multiple sessions, as Torres gradually shared his own story of childhood abuse, foster care, and his use of military service as both escape and redemption. Like Sarah, he had found strength and purpose in military structure, but had always felt that his background disqualified him from leadership roles that required personal openness or vulnerability. Working with Torres and subsequent soldiers, Sarah discovered that her new role was more rewarding than any previous assignment in her military career. She was helping talented soldiers overcome self-imposed limitations, encouraging them to pursue advancement opportunities they had previously avoided, and building their confidence that their background were sources of strength rather than disqualification. 6 months into her new assignment, Sarah received an unexpected visit from General Kellaway, who had come to observe the program's progress and evaluate its effectiveness. They met in Sarah's office, which had become a comfortable space where soldiers felt safe sharing their most guarded secrets. "Captain Martinez," the general began, "I've been reviewing the progress reports from your unit, and the results exceed my most optimistic expectations." She consulted her notes before continuing. 7 soldiers have accepted promotions or advanced assignments they had previously declined. Retention rates in your target population have increased by 30%. Most significantly, soldiers in the program are showing improved performance metrics across multiple areas. The success data was gratifying, but Sarah was more interested in the individual stories of transformation she had witnessed. Soldiers who had spent years hiding their potential were beginning to see themselves as leaders rather than survivors. They were building relationships based on honesty rather than concealment, and discovering that their difficult backgrounds had given them skills and perspectives that enhanced their military effectiveness. "There's something else," General Kellaway said, her tone becoming more formal. "The Secretary of the Army has asked me to brief him on this program's results. If the pilot continues to show these kinds of outcomes, we'll be expanding it Army-wide within 2 years." The implications were enormous, suggesting that Sarah's personal decision to be honest about her background could influence how the entire Army approached soldier support and development. The meeting concluded with General Kellaway presenting Sarah with an early promotion to major, recognizing both her individual performance and her contribution to developing new approaches to military leadership. As Sarah accepted the promotion, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Standing in her office, wearing the oak leaves of her new rank, Sarah thought about the terrified teenager who had enlisted 12 years earlier. That girl could never have imagined that her painful experiences would become the foundation for meaningful service to others, or that her need for concealment would transform into a gift for helping others find courage. The scars on her arm had become symbols of survival rather than shame, qualifications rather than disqualifications, and the foundation for a career dedicated to helping other soldiers discover their own strength. The general salute that day had represented not just military courtesy, but recognition that some battles prepare warriors for service that extends far beyond the battlefield.